issue in both federal and state. So it's not party specific, and it's not state or federal. It's both of those. For me, our take on regulation is the government needs to put a screen over everything it does and ask the question: does the reform make Australia more or less productive as a country? And have the discipline of saying, actually, if it makes us less productive, we're not going to do it. And that discipline, because when you look at any of these things in isolation, they all make sense. I could make a case for all the regulation that's applied to our industry. It's when you cobble it all together as a whole that you end up with the issues. In terms of shipping, it's getting to the point where it's going to be more cost efficient for us to send our fertiliser to India from Townsville than Melbourne. And I have an issue with that.
It is. Rob, the Prime Minister's Manufacturing Task Force, we've now got a new business forum for COAG. We've also had the Queensland election. I'm just wondering how you feel COAG is going to run now.
I think it probably broke down 2 years ago. We had, the greatest moral challenge of our time was energy efficiency. So the idea was to, implement the carbon price scheme, but in association with that was to get rid of all of those state regulatory requirements around VEET schemes in Victoria, individual schemes. None of those schemes have been pulled out. The other thing that's happened is that none of the energy efficiency improvements that need to be made to address these issues that was the focus of COAG have actually been implemented. So talking about energy efficiency in homes, we manufacture insulation in 3 states in Australia. It's cheaper with the additional requirements around regulation, with the additional requirements around carbon tax, no offset for those industries. It's cheaper to bring that insulation from overseas to insulate our homes. I mean, that is just ludicrous to me that's actually where we've ended up with this thing. So, but COAG seems to have broken down. The harmonisation of OH&S seems to have broken down. I know it's a huge opportunity for us. It's a very difficult one for federal government to push through because you've got differences of opinion. And we've seen Campbell Newman come out and say, we're going to change the agenda. We're going to set different agenda for COAG. So it's a very challenging one.
Let me bounce from there to anti-dumping, which of course is a highly technical area. Paper, glass, food, steel, but essentially where products are dumped in Australia below the market price in their own country to capture market advantage here. Again, I'd suggest you actually look at the brochure that's provided for you. But let me throw this one to Phil Jobe from Caprol, because you said to me before that the anti-dumping situation and challenge is really the only issue for you today.
Yes, you've taken a while to get to it. So in a manufacturing environment where you've done the innovation, you've got world's best facilities, you can compete, you've got terrific productivity, and yet the industry is being really hurt by cheap imports that largely depend on government subsidies, and in China's case, a devalued currency. What does a manufacturer in Australia do? So you go to the department runs an anti-dumping case, and you spend, in our case, well over $1 million, and you get an outcome, which in our case we got some duties imposed between 0 and 6%. Exactly the same product out of the same factory, same costing, same pricing, going to the USA had got 30%. Same with Canada, 30%. So clearly, Australia's anti-dumping regime is well behind the times, and it's just not doing the right thing by Australian industry. So the good news is that I think both the government and the coalition have recognised that and are starting to do things about it. And there's been 3 tranches of legislation going to go through. But the reality is, whilst all that helps, there's still much more to be done and needs to be done with urgency. I don't think most people in Australia really understand the impact of what cheap dumped imports are doing to this economy and to this nation. And I think if people fully understood that, there'd just be a massive outcry.
I think you and in fact the whole of the G8, as I call you, do have particular concerns about China, about Australia's recognition of China as a market economy.
Yes, well, one of the main issues we face is that Australia does recognise China as a market economy, and so therefore many of the options that you would otherwise have been cut off from us. And I think the single biggest challenge in Australia is to find ways to rebalance that and to get some equity and some fairness there. And whilst that is a challenge under the WTO rules, I don't think there's a more important thing that the government can do around anti-dumping to really sort of address that key issue. And if it doesn't, many industries and many companies, unfortunately, are going to have to look at the import option rather than manufacturing.
Yeah. So, I'm just going through a couple of things, the subsidies of special market circumstances, the acceptance of financial accounts of companies, which may or may not be rigid-dig, finished goods that contain dumped products, and you've also got quite an issue with the pegging of the yuan to the dollar and that sort of impact.
Yes, all the numbers we've done is that in Australia we can compete with anything that comes out of China. We've got the productivity, we've got the infrastructure, we can compete. It's very hard to compete. People say the high Aussie dollar is a major issue for manufacturers, and that's true, but the bigger issue in our company's case is the undervalued yuan. And if it's undervalued by, pick a number, 20%, that's just a massive competitive disadvantage that we have in Australia. And we need to have mechanisms that can sort of deal with that and level the playing field. And I think that's a major challenge for manufacturers in Australia.
Dick, can I bring you back in here for a minute? Because you mentioned in your speech earlier that this was one of the key areas in terms of an opportunity for industry and government to actually work together. You see customs as very much the body that should be in charge of this area, but it's about training as well, presumably.
Yes, it is, and I look back to my days in DuPont. We were fighting anti-dumping situations back then in the late 80s, early 90s, and what I'm so pleased about more recently has been the efforts of the government, the unions, to really drive towards this. But we've got a roadblock. We've got a roadblock in the customs area that needs customs people with expertise. We need customs people with the, let's say, ability, and again I use that word passion, to get this fixed. And at this moment, I refer it to Phil, that I don't think we've got that at this stage.
No. Well, one of the issues in Australia is even when you get anti-dumping duties placed, until very recently there was just no compliance capability for manufacturers, and just recently they've started opening up containers and testing them and all sorts of things. It's taken us 2 years to get to that point, but there's massive circumvention around product coming into this country, and people from China in particular just find ways to get around it. We need to send the stormtroopers in, and quickly. And we need to sort this mess out.
To China or to?
Let's work on Australia first.
You're talking about
we need some resources in there. At the moment, there's customs resources are looking at, there's boat people coming, there's guns and all the rest of it. And frankly, manufacturing industry is really at the end of the line when it comes to resources and priority. We need to change that. And the good news is that these are things that we can do in Australia. This is within our controls. It's within our levels of competence. We just get on and do some of these things, and it makes a lot of difference to jobs. I'm just passionate about trying to keep Australian jobs here when we can compete, when we have the resources. We can do this. We just need to stop the unfair advantage that a lot of imports have coming in, and it can make a big difference. And I think we just got to get on and do more, and do it more quickly.
And Ticky, this is not about tariff protection.
No.
This is not about subsidies. This is just unlocking the value of what we can do in these sort of areas.
Well, I was actually going to throw it over to Andrew because I just wondered from across the Pacific, how does the US handle this, and do you have a view on how strong Australian manufacturing should be about it?
So the Business Roundtable of America has addressed this document. By the sounds of it, is very similar to it. This is beyond now the manufacturers. This is 3/4 of the New York Stock Exchange market capitalization. So this is a serious body of work. I'm on the executive committee there. It's not sectorial based. It's not manufacturing versus services versus agriculture or resources. It's business. And really what business is saying is what I've just been hearing on this stage, which is we've stovepiped, siloed policy settings. So we have tax policy, we have regulatory policy, we have energy policy, we have healthcare and other benefit policies, we have labour policy, we have education policy. That's all separated itself out. And government has gotten too big in the case of administrating policy, such that the consolidative mechanisms are not working. And so when you go into Washington, where there's 150,000 lobbyists, each of the, this is K Street, each of the lobby groups go in for their piece. They go to the bureaucracy, to the civil servants, the equivalent of the, what you're talking about here. They do send in stormtroopers in some case. What they try to do is they try to influence for their sector. But unfortunately, the cost of doing business is rising and rising and rising. And I think the United States and Australia shares this in common, where we've become free marketers to a fault. We don't understand what globalization has brought on. We don't understand that there are economies like the state owns, in particular China, case in point, real case in point China, who do not play fair. There's free trade but not fair trade. Okay, and so how you actually put in place policies that integrate to actually create competitiveness industries in industries of all type, not just manufacturing, in today's world is a seminal issue. And it really needs a consolidative process. What I heard on regulatory policy here is exactly right. In the case of the US, there's just 60 federal agencies just regulating my sector alone. So one-stop shopping, how to get into a super ministry, call it whatever you like. In the case of what Australia's created, can this one ministry, manufacturing, let's call it, advanced manufacturing if you wish, bring all these topics together into one place? Can you have a consolidative mechanism engaging business? And again, it can be manufacturing, but it can be beyond manufacturing. This is the recommendations we're making to the President. And so you've got the Jeff Immelt Council, the Jobs Council, which is very focused on jobs, the passion around jobs. And you've got the Advanced Manufacturing Partnership that is coming together with these two reports. In an election year, we're not hopeful anything will get done, to be honest. But you really are seeing the same topic. And frankly, the cost of doing business, I'll leave it with one thought, just manufacturing. America, outside of the labor costs issues, put labor completely to one side. It's not the conversation, actually, for most manufacturers. Most manufacturers, it's not labor costs, but that's a perception issue. You take all other costs, the ones we've heard on the podium here today, on the panel, and you benchmark it against OECD countries. America has a cost burden to its manufacturing sector that's 26% higher than the average. In fact, Germany is cheaper in terms of manufacturing costs than the United States, even with a weak dollar. So I'll stop there because this is a big topic beyond even just manufacturing.
Okay. Well, and notwithstanding what you said about labour costs and jobs, our last pillar is industrial relations.
Yes.
And perhaps I could throw to Mark Beardsall because Dick, you mentioned the article about the statistics of factory closing or losing 10% of employees and what was easier. Perhaps I can ask Mike to talk a bit more about that.
Sure. Some of us have been around manufacturing long enough to remember that time in the late 80s and early 90s when we had Accord Mark 1, Accord Mark 2, and that was all about manufacturing working together with labour, whether directly or through unions, to say how can we actually become more productive so that we can open up the economy and still compete. I think the concern today is that that spirit of what is best for the enterprise and how do we make this enterprise more competitive has somehow become lost, and it's not the conversation that we're having very easily. And I think that's particularly the case in the two-speed economy, because we've got half of the economy, which is doing fantastically well, and the Labor side of the equation is basically in an arm wrestle, saying, I'm going to fight you for a bigger chunk of that pie. But what we find is that philosophy spills over into the manufacturing sector that's doing rather less well, and that's still the same arm wrestle that's happening. And so we do find that we have a lot of manufacturing operations that are on the brink today. If you want to close down a manufacturing operation, it's quite easy. The equation for how much employees have to be compensated when they lose their jobs is well known, and it can be done almost at a stroke of a pen. And how tragic that is, that it's so easy to do that. But if you want to have a conversation about, we've got part of our operation that's really not core. There's plenty of that in my company. There's part of it that if we could remove some, let everybody do what they're actually capable of doing rather than having demarcation, we could do better. But those conversations are long and painful, and they take place through the first with a third party through the union, and then with a fourth party through Fair Work Australia, and they just become very, very difficult to progress. And I think that's a great tragedy for our economy. That it's a lot easier just to say, gee, we'll shut up shop, move overseas, than it is to say, let's make this thing more efficient so that we can get through this and keep those jobs in Australia.
Ian Cumming, quite easy, but jolly painful. You lost 1,000 workers, I think, last year. What's your view on the current climate of IR?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very important, I think, example, because I hasten to add that the closure of our blast furnace and a hot strip mill at Western Port and mothballing other plant and equipment had nothing to do with the IR environment. It had everything to do with the kind of macro productivity issues that have been talked about by the panel. That being said, and I think we are at an advantage in manufacturing generally compared to, say, construction, which has been a militant battleground for decades, by and large. We're an advantage in that I think at the union and employer level, there is an understanding about what's important. I don't think there is much, if any, difference in terms of union policy and manufacturing policy in terms of at the macro level and what's required. When we came to the frankly tragic situation of having to close down a blast furnace and losing 1,400 people. It started at 1,000. Your headline at the initial part was correct, but it had to escalate from there. You'd have to say that the engagement with the unions was constructive. They got it, basically. They really understood what was required. However, and as a consequence of that, probably I would say north of 90% of those reductions were voluntary, where we worked with the workforce around their own individual priorities and where they were and so forth.
All right,
But I just do need to say one thing to reinforce the point that Mike has made. Since that time, and that was in September, October, Western Port, we've been in an industrial negotiation since October. That's 5 months. 4 months into the negotiation, the threshold issue of what resources we provide for the union delegate was finally taken off the table. That's the sort of thing that is frustrating. It's the micro product. It's the relationship in the workforce that you move from the big picture, and then you get the distraction
that adds to the other layers of distraction that cause people to not recognise that the parties that are responsible for the consequences of dysfunction need to be they're the issues for them, and that's the test that needs to be put over any review of an industrial relations system. What's the productive relationship at the enterprise level?
Dick, can I just perhaps wrap up this area and say, look, we've got the report, Fair Work Act report on the review coming out in May. You're as a group concerned about the terms of reference of the review and its emphasis on collective bargaining, aren't you? I mean, what hopes do you have for the report and how the IR climate's going to look this year?
A little pessimistic on what we think is the outcome, because the comments, first up you mentioned that the terms of reference are very narrow. They in fact, they don't even include productivity in them. But secondly, the comments that have come from the government in this area saying, well, look, yes, we're going to do this, but we don't really believe there's going to be any changes. That's a bone-shattering comment to make when we're hoping that there'd be a more open discussion. Now, the discussion we had at breakfast this morning with the government hopefully will help to open those doors again. And in talking to the government, they said, well, look, it's all very well, but we haven't been getting some of these examples. And that's one of the reasons why we've set up Manufacturing Australia, actually, that we can focus on some of these examples and bring these forward as real-life examples. It's not much use just talking at the esoteric level, at the high level. It sounds good. I know when I first came into this particular job, I kept asking questions, well, give me some examples of that's actually happening, because if we're going to talk to government, if we're going to talk to any of these groups, we've got to have these examples. And I hope that we're moving down in that direction.
Right. I've just got one more question from me for the panel, and then just to give you a heads up, I might briefly go to some of our politicians here, Kate Lundy, Greg Hunt, Sophie Mirabella, and if you want to. Okay. Just if you would like to make a brief and passionate comment about what you've heard and anything that you really feel is important to say, that'd be great. I'll leave you with one note. I met a couple of very high manufacturing people last night, and maybe it was quite late in the evening, but the one point they did make, or one of them did make, was high tech, high bullshit. We hear this high tech argument all the time being thrown out as the solution to manufacturing. High tech, high tech, high tech. And while the issues of hubs and companies like Cochlear, and I know Ream, you've got a hub story too. But I'm just wondering whether that is an issue for manufacturing, given that we've got a lot of very good low and medium tech stuff here. Germany is not driven, its manufacturing is not driven on high tech. We've got things like mining services. Would anybody on the panel like to buy into that one?
Firstly, the observation I'd make is if you walked into any of our control rooms in operating our plants, you'll see high-tech workers. They're our shop floor people. If I took you on to a mine bench, you'll see people who do the best in the world at what they do. So, number one, I would say actually a lot of Australian manufacturing is high-tech. I think the issue is we need to think broadly around how we're going to build the economy. And it's logical you build the economy off of your comparative advantage. Australia's comparative advantage are our resources. And if you compare us to China, yes, we've got higher wages, but we should have cheap resources. China's got low wages, expensive resources. So the debate ought to be, how do we grow the economy? And to my mind, it's opposite our natural endowments.
We might be a little bit at the other end of the scale. I think if you'd walk into any of our factories, you see a lot of semi-skilled tasks. They're not, highly complex. And like Andrew, I agree that labour is not our primary issue. A lot of our value add and the intellectual property comes in our applied engineering. It comes in the design of our products and how we sell them and how we deploy them. But I think Australia still needs all of workforce to be able to be engaged.
I really think that whole conversation is bullshit, to be frank with you. I think we confuse it, and the headlines is what ends up confusing people. there's high tech right here, and there's no such thing as low tech anymore when you're competing in this world. It's all intellectual property. There's intellectual property in digging stuff out of the ground. There's intellectual property in processing it. There's intellectual property in sending it overseas in a low-cost way. There's intellectual property in putting in place world standards to protect your workers and protect your citizens. The lens we all should have is what this world is bringing to us, which is 7 billion people going to 9 billion people, means we have precious resources that we have to treat with care. Whether it be climate change issues or whether it be water issues that this country has, we have to change our mindset. And it's not either or. And this whole low-tech, high-tech conversation is bullshit. I mean, basically, what we have to do is really reframe the conversation. Manufacturing and its role in an economy, in a balanced economy, is seminal. It's seminal to value add. It's seminal to education. It's seminal to job multiplication. It's seminal to innovation. And there's all of these companies on this stage do all of that. And yet we headline it as smokestack or industrial age, or we have got to educate our population of what creates value and what creates jobs, and to allow state-funded countries to take over our jobs is really doing very poor justice to the next generation, the 7 and 10-year-old conversation James was having. That's where I think the conversation has failed. I actually welcome the fact that we're having the conversation here in Australia. It's only taken me 36 years to actually get onto this panel, so I really appreciate the invitation.
And I think here that we've tended as an industry and a manufacturing group to hide our light under the bushel too, because we've probably tended to more talk about manufacturing as a commodities type product. Certainly we're looking at value added for sure, but just talking BlueScope, I've got 40 PhD people working on innovative ideas to be world competitive, and each of the CEOs in this place have got research people doing that. We need to make sure that people understand that.